A U.S. Army soldier facing charges accused of giving classified military information to a white supremacist group overseas. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams is covering this story. And Pete, what can you tell us about this case?
Well, the FBI and the Army considers this extremely serious, and the soldier who's been arrested here faces a potential life in prison if he's convicted, a sentence of life in prison. His name is Ethan Phelan Melzer. He's 22 years old from Louisville, Kentucky. He's an Army private. He joined the Army in 2018, and according to criminal charges that have been filed in New York, he began to communicate on a website that's known to be used by followers of an obscure, fringy, white supremacist, neo-Nazi satanic group called the Order of the Nine Angles, O9A, and another group that followed this. And they say based on his own racism and his own hatred, he began to discuss on this chat room that he was in a military unit in Italy that would soon be deploying to Turkey, and in essence said, I'm going to tell you when we're going to go there so that you can arrange for jihadists to attack our unit when we're on the way to a military base in Turkey. Now, the FBI then began to talk with him, a confidential informant, someone he was communicating with that he did not realize was working with the FBI, and they began to discuss these details in a sort of message-to-message situation. And finally, he was arrested on June 10th, and according to these court documents, the FBI says that he confessed and admitted that he did all of this. So he's been charged. He's come back to New York, and he was facing charges today, will be facing charges in federal court in Manhattan.
It's some case. Pete Williams, thanks so much for getting us up to speed here.
You bet.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.